You are listening to the North American Kings podcast, your traditional masculinity training ground. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski, founder of North American Kings LLC, a leadership development company based in Cincinnati, Ohio. As we all know, the man brand has taken an absolute beating over the past few decades, and it's our mission to change that. We're going to do that by helping you join the fight to reclaim traditional masculine values. Welcome to headquarters. Training starts now. Welcome back to the training ground, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski. We've got a very insightful show for you today. This episode was going to be a little bit more fun, but in doing some of the research for what was going to be a very brief highlight, turned into something much bigger, and I think it needs to be addressed somewhat quickly. So, on that note, let's get started. Before we get going, I do have an announcement. The website's built. So we're finally launched, and I'm excited to be able to offer something tangible to our listeners. Until I can take this full time, we're starting slow and we're starting small. So right now we're able to offer mentorship services virtually and in person, particularly for anybody who's in the Northern Kentucky region. Anyone looking to sign up for either the mentorship program to be put on an interest list for one of our practical workshops, or if you'd like to volunteer, please visit our website at northamericankings.com for details. And a big thanks to our friends at Naked Armor Razors and Wet Shave Gear. These guys have made a lot of this happen. As our sole sponsor, they can't make everything happen for us, but they've gone above and beyond helping us cross-promote and offering my listeners a discount for helping in this partnership. This company is run by some very great folks who embrace the mission of providing men a superior product. They're in this for the long haul with every one of their customers. Case in point, over the life of your blade, after all the sharpening that you do, if your blade ever needs to be rehoned, Naked Armor will handle that for free. And while they rehone it, they'll actually send you out a free shavette so that you can maintain your groomed look. To get you started, my listeners can enjoy a 15% discount on anything in their online store by going to nakedarmorrazors.com and entering coupon code KINGS15. Don't wait to enjoy the highest quality shave you'll ever give yourself. Go to nakedarmorrazors.com. All right, so on this episode of North American Kings, I want to set something up. I want to set the stage for, I want to say, somewhat of a strategic retreat. We do not support losing strategies. There's this ideological trap out there. It's called the Kafka Trap. And this is coined by a man named Eric Raymond in his analysis of a book called The Trial, authored by Franz Kafka. The Kafka Trap consists of a logical fallacy that is nevertheless ensnaring people, and it actually flips a guilty argument in what I've seen. So here's how it works. Example, you're accused of being a racist, for this, that, or some other thing. You deny it for this reason and this reason. So X and Y reasons. Well, then the person you're defending yourself against will actually use your denial as proof that you are in fact a racist, right? Only a racist could say that they're not a racist. And around and around and around you go into the trap. Nobody goes. So in this particular case, it's not meant to make sense. So if you're scratching your head, it's okay to feel put off. That's normal. The idea is to create a non-falsifiable position. Again, it's something that they can't refute. Social justice warriors and feminists love this tactic because it flips the American system of justice on its head. And it's also, again, very hard for you to get out of. We've been brought up largely as a country to assume that people are innocent until proven guilty. It's one of the beauties of the American justice system. So in this example, you are guilty to start off with, and you have to argue for your innocence. Those valid points are used to convict you of something that you haven't even engaged in. Remember, this is the point. How are you meant to prove something that you're innocent of and it didn't even happen? There's no proof of something that didn't exist. That's a bad position to start with. And that's that's something that we've seen countless times in our justice system, and we've seen a lot of people falling for this, particularly on college campuses. Men, look out. If any of my listeners are in college, in case you were not aware of this, consider this active intelligence that will potentially save you down the road. Right now, consent can be withdrawn retroactively. Let me repeat that. Women, by law, can withdraw consent to a sexual encounter anywhere throughout the encounter or even after the fact when it's done and over. Okay? This law was created with good intentions, and I believe that, right? Like, we have to legislate some things, okay? If things start to go sideways during a sexual encounter, that woman doesn't want, if she doesn't want things to continue, you don't get to finish. All right? And the authors of these laws have codified that. That's a good thing, right? That's common decency. I'll admit that was the goal, but I'm also willing to admit that guys who decide to finish, I'm willing to bet that happens too. And they're animals, right? They're not what I would consider a traditional masculine guy, right? Now, the problem with this law is that it doesn't have a statute of limitations. Rape doesn't. And it shouldn't, right? Well, I mean, we could argue whether it should or not. Again, if there's a problem at the end of this, right? But couple this with the legal code where, quote, additionally, submission, including submission due to fear, fright, coercion, or realization that in the particular situation resistance is futile, is not consent. And that's from State versus Ricks, 34 of North Carolina. Let's repeat that. Let's look at that last part. Realization that in the particular situations resistance is futile is not consent. So what it's allowing to be said, again, might not have been the intent, but this is the letter of the law. So a woman saying yes is not necessarily a yes if in her head she's submitting rather than consenting. Right? I guess when I convince my wife to throw me one when she's not exactly in the mood, I guess that's considered submission, right? Or is she just doing me a favor? Again, the law's a little shaky on this, and we don't intend it to be. It shouldn't be. Now, the point was made clear to me personally by a police officer at a conference back in 2009. This is not something new, all right? But these points are continually being reviewed, and they were reviewed as early as 2019. In these cases, however, the justice system is backwards, where you have to prove your innocence first, rather than the system having to prove that you actually did something wrong. Again, designed to benefit women who, I'm not condoning rape. That's not the point. But this is something that has actively been used as a weapon. I've been blogging about this for years. Where girls will vengefully withdraw consent, ruining the lives of emerging young men. Consent right now is a battle that needs to be fought. All right? I am not advocating rape. Now, there will be someone who will misconstrue this because they want to. But let me repeat, I am not advocating for rape. However, women need to make themselves very clear when they want to withdraw consent. Wishy-washy signals that they're not interested. This happened to Aziz Ansari, the comedian. Who I know him from Parks and Rec, but he was a huge Me Too guy, and he still got hit with the wishy-washy, he wasn't reading my signals excuse. And she tried to cancel him. Right now, whether he deserved it or not, again, I wasn't there. But if you guys read through that entire exchange, it was rather dicey. All right? But the greater point is that we can't be allowing ourselves to fight unnecessary fights. All right? I'm I'm actually, again, I'm advocating for us to just disregard the toxic masculinity fight. Right? I'll get to that in just a second, but this one needs to be fought for because it's being used, and it's being used effectively to flip the justice system so that we as men can't defend ourselves properly in court against one of the most heinous charges that we could ever face. It's not right. It's not our justice system. It's still being practiced somehow, and only those who are actively fighting this, and very publicly so, are actually coming out on top. Now, what I'm advocating for men is to vigorously pursue and push to define when consent can be withdrawn. All right, North Carolina and other southern states are continuing to go through with this, but as these boys get acquitted or ruined in college, I mean, it's either one. I'm hoping that they push for this as well. Clarification is what we want. At what point can consent be withdrawn? Right? In the middle of it, it gets dicey. Right? At the very end, again, what's the point? After the fact, there's no taking that back. Right? So after the deed's done, it shouldn't be something that we can take, it can be taken away. Now, as a safeguard, gentlemen, I encourage you to date women seriously before engaging in sexual acts. All right? If you think a girl, if a girl thinks that you love her and thereby consents, only to have you break things off the next morning, that's going to give her a case for consent under false pretenses. You do not want to have to prove this. All right? Now, take it from the officer who talked to me in 2009. She said, gentlemen, make sure that you love her and make sure she loves you. Now, messy breakups are messy breakups, but, that was some pretty sage advice from someone who clearly was uncomfortable with the logical fallacies of those policies. All right. Now, one fight that can absolutely be abandoned is the one over toxic masculinity. I've been discovering over the past few years that the definition of toxic masculinity is varying, to say the least. Our detractors use it as they wish. It's, they're intentionally leaving it vague so that it can encompass more and more behavior, even behavior that we would consider, like normal people would consider normal. While the vague nature of the meaning of toxic masculinity is a passive assault, the active broadening of the definition is far more aggressive. So this was Gillette's failing back in 2019. They broadened the definition of toxic masculinity so much so, and so publicly so, that people started boycotting their products. That's one of the many reasons I actually started looking for a new razor company, where I went and found Naked Armor and their great products. The commercial that I believe the entire world has seen by now features bullies. There's a misogynistic board member. There's guys catcalling. Is this the best that men can get? A play off their slogan. In this commercial, that likely did them more harm than good. There were a lot of normal things in there. A party, how realistic is this? A partygoer interrupts a music video being recorded to say that it's wrong to film women in bikinis dancing to rap music. Really? Is that normal behavior? I would almost argue that it's a choice. Those women were being paid to do that. Whether or not it's morally good or not, all right. But that party goer stopping a live production of a music video, I think that's a stretch. I think for anyone normal. There's also, this was my absolute favorite, there's an assembly line of dads looking on as two boys are fighting. And it goes on down the line. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Yeah, they will. I've got 3. All they want to do is fight. Sometimes it's bad, sure, like when one's pummeling the other one. But this commercial painted over all of these grilling dads with the same brush that they did the misogynist boardroom guy or the guy making sexually lewd gestures towards his household maid in front of his kids, right? Like, sure, some of the stuff in there was a bit sketchy and what wouldn't fly today, right? But also, you had very normal behavior all of a sudden being pushed out there. The defense of this video was very telling as well, right? Headlines can still be found from your favorite newspapers. Gillette commercial controversy. Men should just get over it and adopt to Me Too era. And backlash against Gillette commercial exposes male privilege, right? Like, of course they would not take it seriously. Josh Barrow of New York Magazine had it right, actually, in my opinion, where he theorized that the likely response to the Gillette commercial was that the average man would say, "Who is Gillette to tell me anything?" Citing that the tone of the ad was accusatory and hardly featured an actual razor. I mean, looking back at it, I don't think I saw one. And I watched it a couple times before this show was even recorded. Right? But Gillette's overbroadening of their definition of toxic masculinity is what caused this visceral reaction. In financial terms, from Georgiev, net sales from the grooming segment of P&G, that's Procter & Gamble, fell from $6.5 billion in fiscal 2018 to drop to $6 billion, 100 million in fiscal year 2019. That's a decline of $352 million US dollars. This is a direct quote. There's a relative year-over-year decline of 6.5%. Given that the ad only happened mid-fiscal year 2019, it can be supplicated that if the trend remains, the result in fiscal year 2020 might be even worse. End quote. His analysis is linked to the show description. Accounting for 2020, he went back and updated the article. Gillette lost another 2%. So we can say at the very least, regardless of what little effort they've made to rectify the situation, with their chief customer base, they haven't made up any ground. Now, overall in 2019, Procter & Gamble wrote off $8 billion because of Gillette's performance in general. But the CEO of Gillette said it's a price worth paying. Okay. Right? I'm sure that went over well. Right? Now, the response to this article brings us to the Kafka Trap. The only people who could be upset with this ad must be toxic men. No. That's not the case. Right? And in fact, that's why the front of this war needs to be abandoned writ large. Let's abandon toxic masculinity. It's a term defined by feminists and misandric men. Right? That gives them total control of what they define it as, and they change it based on their whims. So, what element of that fight can we control? Certainly, the field we choose to fight on is something that we can have direct control over, right? So let's disengage, right? Let's cede bad ground and force them to hold it, right? That's actually a principle that you can read about in The Art of War by Sun Tzu. So in ceding the ground is always a good idea. An example, she says, "That's so toxic," right? You could start with, "You don't know what that means." Now, that's a somewhat pithy way of saying, define that, which we know they never do. They don't have an example of that. You could use that particular argument when they're talking about gun rights, when they're talking about taxation, when they're talking about racism. Define it. Say it out loud. I want to hear you say it out loud. They don't want to do that. They want to keep things vague. They want to keep us on our toes. And so far, it's working. But you can also use the redirect to deflate them. That's so toxic. and you're looking at this situation, you say, what you mean X, Y, and Z that dude is doing? Now, this requires you to actually notice positive things, or to at least filter through what you're observing and pick out some good stuff. You follow that with a slight pause, and then you say, well, if you say so. Or you can also jump in with my favorite, and this is the active pivot in disengage, and it goes exactly like this. That's toxic. That was fun. How about what now? And totally sets off the tone. Like, if you want to go down this road, we can. I'd like not to ruin our relationship, right? But either way, we need to be disengaging from this, because it's ground that continues to change. We're playing in a football field where the goalposts move, and it's not something that's going to ultimately lead us to making any progress on either front. The other element of the battlefield that we can control is who we ally ourselves with. This is the tricky part. Dudes, be careful who you get into bed with. The United States got into bed with Russia at the end of World War II. That wasn't because we liked Joseph Stalin, who was arguably a more psychopathic and a worse killer than Hitler was. All right? It was because we needed to. That was the turning point of World War II, but it also precipitated the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a divided Germany, forever changing the course of Germany's development. Right? Let's not make similar mistakes. We discussed on the latter part of the last episode that, we discussed how to identify some of our allies. And that's a tricky thing these days. Right? There are things that you can do in order to get specific attention. It's not the over politicized or hyperbolic dog whistle. It's carrying yourself a certain way. It's saying things out loud that get the attention of the people that you want to attract. Right? Other men, other real men, other guys who believe in the values of traditional masculinity. Right? Real men are paying attention to the areas around them, right? And because they speak to us, these things that we do speak to us in such a profound way, we'll pick up on those things and become interested. This isn't gang signs and shadow marks. It's seeing in others values that we hold in esteem. Jordan Peterson recently described this as a subconscious reaction that triggers our instinct to imitate. Now, that certainly makes sense after you think about it for a while. That need to immediately imitate gets us actively perceived. It's actively perceived as knowing. That belief, the magnetic draw that we've talked about often here, when we see a real man and we want to be like him, we want to follow that person. That's our instinct, that we want to imitate that. That's us knowing. That's something real. Now, where will you find out, where you will find allies out there, you're also going to find two groups. Okay? You're going to find your detractors. And that's people who fundamentally don't understand men in this case, or those who actively want men to fail. Those folks are extremely easy to spot, right? Better yet, they usually make themselves known, right? So look for the normal signs. Like they're not hard to see. But then there are men out there that have been engaged in this discussion for a while, sometimes longer than we have. And I'm not sure how advisable this is, but upon discovering this, I want to give you a high-level overview of what's really out there. Okay, for those teenagers listening to this, and to the men who are feeling a bit jaded about the situation that we are finding ourselves in, I tell you, at the risk of losing you to some of these guys. All right, I've said before that I believe in personal agency, so I believe that you guys will make the right choice. So here's some information from a source from me, and I hope you've grown to trust some of this stuff. Again, to the teens listening to this program is meant to empower you to take control of your own destinies regardless of what situation is out there in the world. These traditional masculine values will help you move forward and better yourselves regardless of the situation out there. All right, the groups that I'm about to tell you about have reacted to the same worldview that you are currently navigating, and they have taken a horribly wrong direction. It is the antithesis of what we're trying to get done here. Okay? So this is where the water gets murky. I want you to be on your guard. Do some cursory research on this. It seems like these different groups observing different, actually, they're observing very similar trends in the social fabric of our society. Like reading through some of their posted work, like the stuff that they produce, a lot of their grievances aren't necessarily wrong. Some of the points they make are even mentioned here, like we've discussed them. However, our paradigms are on the entire world are extremely different. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term paradigm and what that is, simply explain it's a different angle that you can look at big ideas from. Okay, it's a version of perspective. All right, so I want to describe this clearly so you guys know what I'm talking about. Assume that the idea of masculinity is a cylinder. All right. Now, if you have a particular viewpoint, it's like looking at the cylinder from directly on top of it. To you, it would look like a two-dimensional circle, right? To have another viewpoint is to occupy a different paradigm. Let's say you'd be looking at it directly from the side. That would present the exact same issue. It would look like a rectangle, a two-dimensional rectangle. All right, now looking at the same issue, of course, I'm looking at a rectangle. You must be. There's no way that you're right. You see a circle? No, there's no way. Right? It's a different point of view that puts things in entirely different perspectives. A real world example of this, right? It's the introduction of the cell phone, to the average consumer. Think about that. Now, for you kids, I mean, you guys probably aren't even familiar with landlines or payphones. Man, as a guy who lived through them both, it's a little bit different, right? Like I still pick up phone calls on my cell phone from numbers I don't know, right? Like that's usually a characteristic you find of somebody who actually had a landline way back in the day. But the paradigm shift was pretty paramount. And instead of calling a place, like I'd call this house, knowing that the phone was probably in the kitchen, and I'd call and I'd say, or I'd pick up and say, Kowalski residence, this is Glenn. And whoever was on the other phone would introduce themselves and say something, hey, I'm looking for your father. Right? I'm going to yell for dad and he'd come down, or my mom or whoever. But the idea was that you were calling a place. Now, you're calling a person, a direct, like me or you, right? That changes everything. It collectively shifted how people viewed interpersonal communication, right? Like, are you guys comfortable when people actually call you anymore? Or do I got to text you first? Right? Those are paradigm shifts. So we've subtly, they're very subtle, but we've completely shifted how we view things. And we're speaking from over here, and it sounds different, doesn't it? Right? It's very subtle. Now, the paradigm that I'm inviting you into, this one, is highly positive. It encourages you to explore your own personal agency and can be used to function with other normal people in normal society. I cannot stress that enough. Espousing these different methodologies will make functioning with others in the workplace, at home, or out in the real world far more difficult. Okay? Now, the first group I'd like to point out is this MGTOW group. Okay? It's an acronym, and I'm not one of these guys, so I don't know, right? But it's spelled MGTOW. Okay, the acronym stands for Men Going Their Own Way. This group is made up of men who have completely given up on pursuing relationships with women. All right, they're frustrated. They don't get it. It's again, I'm not going to understand these people, but I'm like trying to empathize. I kind of get it. At face value, it seems like these guys are onto something. It does. You know, they've given up on relationship buildings because masturbation is easier than talking to women or suffering through rejection. Right now, that again is a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's fair in some respects. Right now, it's very difficult. There have been articles after articles after articles written that it is very difficult for kids, like teenagers, to go up and actually engage with like a cute girl. And when he does and he fails, it is like awful. And I remember doing that when I was a kid, right? And you kind of got over it. I wasn't given another option. These guys have another option. And actually, we'll discuss that when we talk about pornography in like another couple episodes. God, there's always something to talk about, right? But now that porn is so prevalent in our society, they've got an out. They've got a way to take care of that. But it's ultimately self-defeating. There are several sympathetic articles on reference that reference these guys. And again, the common cause for men to just throw in the towel to pursue this philosophy is seeing other good men torn down by divorce and family courts. Like, that's what they're seeing. They don't think it's worth the risk. You know, these guys are not as stable as they like to paint themselves. Okay, that's the thing. They like to say, and a lot of the sympathetic articles will say, hey, these guys actually, they've seen a friend, a good close friend, go through divorce and go through family courts, and they get totally taken. They get taken to the, God, I forget what it is, but they get taken to the woodshed. They get taken to the cleaners. I think that was the one, right? They're left with nothing. And you know what? Sometimes it happens, right? But that is still not the whole story. All right. Now, these guys actually have bylaws and more organized philosophy than some other groups that I've come across. Now, that I've been made aware of some dark circles of the men's rights movement, right? This these spheres that I'm now walking in as just a normal guy. So I'm discovering this maybe a little later than I probably should have even starting this. But here are some of the rules that the MGTOW groups will actually want you to follow. Law number 1. I'm calling them that. I don't know what they call them. Do not get married. Do not cohabitate. Do not procreate. Rid yourself of gynocentrism and follow your own dreams. Now, the last two were changed a little bit later. I'll discuss that in just a moment. But let's get one thing straight. There's nothing here that is overly helpful to mankind, like at all, much less to the gentleman actually trying to practice them. I've spoken about the benefits of marriage, and I believe that wholeheartedly. Right now, divorce and family courts do heavily favor females in any exchange. And we've had divorce lawyers on the show. However, having had friends go through this process, if kids aren't involved, it's actually a quite simple process. And I hate to put it like that. But the benefits of a good, healthy marriage outweigh the potential risk. The problem is getting to a healthy relationship. And that's what takes some diligence on our part. Men, be selective. Right? Following through on your cardinal responsibilities is an incredible first step. They immediately make you more marketable towards the female demographics. This isn't about being an alpha, beta, or an alpha, a beta, or even this new, apparently there's a new Sigma male that's out there right now. That's absolute BS. Do not listen to that, right? But throw whatever label you want on yourself. Espousing traditional masculine values like being bold, ambitious, responsible, even, and emotionally secure. Practicing these things are universally appealing. Nothing I just described require you to have a Greek god physique. It's about acting like men. And this will set you on the path to being able to attract the right kind of woman. And because you'll become more confident, secure, you'll be able to pick from the good ones. Not frivolously either. I encourage you to take your time in selecting them for the reasons I mentioned in the first segment, but also because you run a much lower risk of things devolving in a bad way, which would lead to divorce or some other negative effects. Right? If you take your relationship seriously, this problem kind of goes away. An example, I got engaged to my wife after 4 months of dating. Right? I knew after 2. However, we spent 3 years engaged. Now, this wasn't intentional, but it did force us to take the relationship extremely seriously from a very early point. It also allowed us to talk through our views on marriage and where we wanted our joint life to go. And personally, I started crushing the 4 cardinal responsibilities immediately. I mean, I treated her like my wife from day one. And my wife got a great feel for what life would look like once we got rings on. Right now, just remember, an engagement is just a ring. It's not final until you sign the marriage license. Right? These MGTOW guys have zero faith left. And like we discussed last week, they've succumbed to despair. They've been so dejected by the prospects of pursuing relationships that they've frozen completely and now flee of their own accord. They see a crazy, weird world where they have no hope of getting ahead or dealing with enough risk. Like they're not capable of it. Now, these guys have abandoned personal agency. They've ceded any hope of taking control of what they can affect, leaving them adrift. Now, Jordan Peterson said something very profound. Abstinence because you cannot attract someone is not a virtue. And some of these guys are resting on that as an excuse to walk away. They somehow think that wallowing in their shame is somehow going to make them feel better. That never works. It is not a morally upright thing to just abandon relationships because you can't keep up or you can't compete. Like that's not a healthy behavior. Even from a secular perspective, having faith in yourself at the very least will be a benefit. Trust in your own judgment. Trust your ability to weigh risks and think about the situation free of bias. Right? I told this to my father when he found out I was going to propose. When he's like, "Are you sure? It's only been a couple months." And I was certain. I felt certainty unlike anything I've ever felt before. But what I said to my father was, worst case, at this point, if things fall apart, I'm only out a tax return. And that put things into fiscal perspective for my father. Think about the last tax return that you got, gentlemen. You blow all of it or half of it on a ring, and things go sideways, and she takes the ring during a split. What were you really going to spend that money on anyway, right? A PS5? Was the possibility of finding the best thing you'd ever experienced in your life, was that worth that gamble? I'd say so. I didn't buy something frivolous this year. Okay. Right? Now, a sympathetic voice for the MGTOW movement said something that I do agree with. He pointed to the last 2 of their little bylaws, and he had some commentary. The last law was rid yourself of gynocentrism, and then the last one was follow your own dreams. Well, these things, read free of the subject matter, actually make some sense. Right? Don't live your life in pursuit of flesh, or don't focus on how you are perceived by anybody else, really, but much less by women. That's a fair point. I would encourage men out there to, hey, wash yourself, do all those things that you do to look fresh in case someone does, happen to take notice. I mean, those aren't bad things to do. Those are healthy, even if you do intend to stay alone. Right? I mean, and that's the thing about these guys is that they're choosing. They're choosing to stay by themselves, which is what garners some sympathy for these folks. Right? But adults shouldn't live like that under normal circumstances, like living for other people. And then following your own dreams, that's also a good message. While it's a good message, it does lend itself to material pursuits. Get a good job. And then what? Follow your dreams of learning to play the guitar. Like, to what end? We are a social species, primarily driven towards building families. To take the potential of building a lasting relationship, to take that off the table, it leaves men without purpose. And I'll get to our lack of purpose here in a couple of minutes or even a couple of episodes, right? The second of the three groups, though, and this is the one that I want to discuss, and this is the more violent, militant of the groups out there. Now, you may have heard of these guys before. I'll be honest with you, only until recently have I come across some of these guys in any regular way, all right? That group, they're called Incel, or like a dude would be called an Incel, all right? Now, that's slang and short, coined in 2018 as involuntary celibate. All right, now listen to that name. I mean, involuntarily without sex is what that translates to. Right? For those who don't want to think too hard about it, I get it. It's late. But according to the sympathetic source that I've gotten some of this information from, and I looked deep for this stuff, it's nuts out there. All right. But according to that sympathetic source that I mentioned earlier, he touched on these guys as well. The biggest difference between this group and again the MGTOW guys is that the MGTOW guys, again, it's voluntary, right? They're walking away from relationships. These incel guys aren't, right? So you've got active want and natural urges with no hope of fulfilling that basic need. That gets a little weird. Right now, Dennis Prager, famed conservative philosopher, has stated time and time again that there aren't three basic human needs. There's actually four. That's food, water, shelter, and sex. And that makes sense to me. Like, I heard that. I'm like, oh man, one of the most conservative guys I've ever heard in my entire life is actually saying that sex is necessary. Okay. Now, again, we can get into when you guys start pursuing that, but that certainly explains those biological and social functions that we have as humans. But more germane to the subject matter, the MGTOW guys have decided to walk away from the game completely, so to speak. And I call it the game, just, what else are you going to call it, right? Now, where the incel crowd is forced to is forced from one thing or another for one reason or for what, I don't know. Now, this is leading this group to some dark places. Now, I've gone to their home on the internet, and it's a dark place. Now, I don't know if you've ever been able to feel hate, rage, and despair through a computer screen. And maybe it was my own personal bias walking into this, but I can tell you that feeling can exist. With the lack of one of Prager's four human needs, it doesn't take much to imagine how misguided males are likely to react. Go back to instincts. Like, what would you do if you weren't getting a basic human need? And true to form, we've seen several instances of violence, even mass shootings by the liberal term, take place over the course of the last few years, directly attributed to this incel movement. And according to Incel Wiki, the demographics, while not entirely male, are extremely diverse with regards to country of origin, race. Now, according to our sympathetic source from a few moments ago, there are a few classifications of this real incel crowd. He describes there's the true cell, if I'm pronouncing that right, which who cares, which is the guy who is too damaged to even leave the house. He can't get rejected because he can't even communicate with women. He's the epitome of failure. That's according to this guy's words. Then there's the standard incel. The guy actually functions somewhat in the real world. He asks women out on dates. He gets rejected all the time. Quote, because lookism, hypergamy, and black pill prove that this guy will never get a yes response ever. And then he mentions the premium incel, which is someone who can get dates but never closes the deal. Now, this person can't even turn dates into like a series of dates that might lead to an intimate relationship. He's handsome enough for girls to date, but not enough for them to commit to in any real way. Now, on both of these platforms, they mentioned the black pill a few times. Now, before parents out there freak out, this is metaphorical. The black pill is something darker than the proverbial red pill that wakes you up to the world around you. The black pill is an experience or perspective on an issue that is meant to bridge you from one paradigm to another. It's personified as bitter, hard to swallow information that will rock your worldview. From Urban Dictionary, it's a state of mind brought upon by the realization of harsh truths, seeing reality and or society for what it truly is beyond the illusion of equality we are led to believe. It is the understanding that life is ultimately unfair and that winners and losers are determined, for the most part, by circumstances beyond one's control, like looks, wealth, mental condition, height, race, family, luck, etc. The despair that arises from taking the black pill can be crippling and might drive some to the brink of insanity, thus the expression cope or rope. Again, pretty dark stuff. And they lean on this as a stepping stone towards, quote, enlightenment, since Buddha actually was like a black pillar. But he espoused something called the white pill too, which, I'll be honest with you, I did not get into. Now while the MGTOW group was given to despair, these guys, these incels, are also embody the element of rage and then added to it. They've suggested ways to fix this, but the solutions you get radical pretty quick. Forced re-education of women, actively, slut shaming, a return to the 1950s norms. Now, I'll admit, like, some of the 1950s stuff sounds pretty good, with regards to modern social culture, but these guys are going in a very extreme way to get there. Right? Now, one person mentioned selectively breeding women and taking all of their the emotional decisions out of the equation. Yeah, that's super helpful, right? Now, do you guys see where this goes? Like, it doesn't go anywhere good. Right? According to some sources, on this, 78% of incels suffer from extreme sadness, anxiety, or stress. 82% have considered suicide, and 62% have considered surgery to improve their looks. And that was kind of that lookism that they mentioned. Like, a lot of these guys blame their physical looks or their like deformities or whatever their physical condition is. They blame that on, that's kind of luck, but they blame that for their situation. And that's not a healthy way to be. In most articles written by incels, there's a lack of hope as deep as it is, it's so much so that no practical advice will ever take for these folks because they've tried everything. They've done everything they possibly could have in order to break this, and they can't. That's defeatism, and it gets you nowhere. Now, I mentioned, there's a group in here that I I skipped over a little bit, but there's also a group, the pickup artist, that there's not a lot of information on. I mean, there are more tips than descriptions out there, but the pickup artist group, the best way to describe it, if you guys have ever seen the very popular How I Met Your Mother series, Barney Stinson was a bite. He was a great character in the show. He was the closest I can really get you to that pickup artist. I can pick up any woman, had hundreds and hundreds of hookups. One of his biggest accomplishments was hitting like 200. It was a little bit crazy, right? But the difference here, I think what made that character a little bit more lovable is because he was more of a sex addict that was trying to use sex to fill a hole in himself, where the pickup artist and the toxic ones, I use that word, but the pickup artists that we want to be aware of, those are the guys that are doing it as in a predatory fashion, right? And if you guys run into these guys, we want to avoid them too, all right? Because those aren't values that we are espousing. I just got done telling you guys to take relationships seriously, not sleeping around, because it is detrimental to your mental well-being as much as it is any of the women's. All right. Now, the last group that I want to mention are divorce groups and men's rights activist groups. Now, the danger with these guys isn't that they're not useful or necessary in some cases, However, there is a crazy amount of crossover. All right. Divorce groups and MRA groups are very common. And most of the guys involved are just like me, right? Like I'm unaffiliated with any of these groups, but while I've been exploring these circles, I've discovered several guys who actively claim to be incels and MGTO and guys who are MGTOW, right? So as I've tried to explore these circles, I've run into these incels and guys who have gone their own way, so they're going through the same motions with other groups. And that's kind of where the trouble is. So I talk about the benefits of fatherhood a lot. And in some of these conversations about fatherhood, these guys pop up, and now now you, or in this case, me, we're associated with these folks who don't even have the same goal in mind. So let me state for the record, North American Kings isn't affiliated with any incel or MGTOW groups, like at all. The MRA and fathers groups that we are in contact with, we do keep at arm's length. Why? Because we don't know them enough yet to determine whether or not the relationship will actually align. Right? And that's something that's very important. Right? I encourage each of you to be just as diligent in your efforts to find and support other men, right? Distance yourselves from the incel and the MGTOW group as best you can. At the very least, they're going to drag you down when they're around. They're not going to be that fun to be around. Like, who wants to be around despair all the time? That stuff is contagious. I can feel it through a computer screen. You can definitely feel that in person. Now, I hope some of them actually listen to this program. Like, there is hope out there. They might find that they're not totally lost. Now, I don't know anyone who is so lost that they couldn't come back. Right? They'll end up calling me, or maybe even you, a Chad. Right? That's the definition for someone who's succeeding at being a man. And while it's meant to be derogatory, it makes me want to swear. At the end of the day, you got to wear it like a badge of honor. Like, that guy is low key admitting that you're getting it right. All right. So take solace in that, but always be wary of who you get in bed with, both literally and figuratively. Like Russia and World War II, I'm more than willing to help these guys out, but the association that they're coming from needs to be left behind. Right? That's not an alliance we need. Right? In World War II, we needed Russia to defeat Nazi Germany. That was an absolute fact, especially with Japan. We absolutely needed that to actually happen. So him switching sides, like Joseph Stalin coming over, that was going to happen. We weren't in a position to say, hey, you got to stop being a socialist, communist nightmare, right? We didn't have the clout to do that. We do in this situation. We do not need these other guys. And in this particular case, they're not even trying to get us to the same goal. I am all for repairing relationships between the male and female sex of society, right? Regardless of the intentions of the other group, right? Again, I'm on an active path to help do this. The active in the other direction is feminism, and we're going to clash a little bit. But ultimately, I want to help people foster very healthy relationships, and by building men into better men, or teaching dudes to be real men, will ultimately help society in a positive way. All right. Now, man, we don't need those allies, but what an episode, huh? I was going to get to some stuff about political capital. I was going to mention some businessy stuff because that seems to be a little bit of our niche. But coming across this stuff for the first time this week was too important to put off. So I appreciate you guys going on this journey with me today. The last thing I want is for some kid to come across our material, want more information, and then stumble into these yahoos without knowing how dark these philosophies can get. All right, so we'll get to some of the regularly scheduled programming next week, but today, that's our show, folks. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski. If you liked this episode, please leave us a 5-star review and follow us or subscribe for free wherever you get your podcast. Also, please encourage your friends to check us out. We're growing, and we can certainly use the help. We're on Apple Podcasts, Rumble, YouTube, and wherever else you get your content. Good luck out there.